The silver chains around Lyra's wrists clinked like wind chimes as she scrubbed the marble floors of the Moonstone Palace's grand hallway. Each link bore an ancient symbol, a crescent moon turned upside down, marking her as the pack's greatest disgrace. The enchanted metal was cold against her skin, designed not just to bind but to suppress, to contain whatever dangerous force had destroyed her life 3 years ago. Scrub. Rinse. Move forward. Repeat. The rhythmic motions had become meditation over the months, a way to quiet the whispers that followed her through the corridors. Even now, at 5 in the morning when most of the palace slept, she could feel eyes watching from shadowed alcoves. Servants whispered about the fallen Beta's daughter, the cursed Omega who had brought shame upon one of the most respected families in the Moonstone Pack. The marble beneath her brush was pristine white veined with silver, expensive stone quarried from the sacred lunar peaks where their ancestors had first received the moon's blessing. It reflected her face in fractured pieces, auburn hair pulled back severely, violet eyes that marked her as different even among werewolves, and skin too pale from years spent scrubbing in shadows instead of running under moonlight. Well, well. Look what we have here. Lyra's shoulders tensed at the sickeningly sweet voice. She didn't need to look up to know that Cassandra Silvermane had arrived with her entourage of sycophants. The future Luna's designer heels clicked against the marble with deliberate precision, each step calculated to announce her importance. "Good morning, Miss Silvermane," Lyra said quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. "Future Luna Silvermane," Cassandra corrected sharply. "Though I suppose someone of your station might forget proper etiquette." Laughter rippled through Cassandra's followers, 3 young she-wolves from prominent families who had once been Lyra's closest friends. Before the awakening ceremony. Before everything changed. Cassandra crouched down, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders like spun sunlight. She was beautiful in the way that came from perfect breeding and unlimited resources, with emerald eyes that could shift from warmth to cruelty in an instant. Today, they held only malice. "You missed a spot," Cassandra said, pointing to a section of floor that gleamed like a mirror. Lyra looked where she indicated, seeing nothing but perfect marble. "I don't see." Cassandra's designer heel came down hard, grinding a clump of dirt from the garden into the pristine stone. The she-wolves behind her burst into giggles. "There," Cassandra said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Now you see it." Heat flashed through Lyra's chest, anger, humiliation, and something else that made the chains around her wrists grow warm. For a moment, the marble beneath her seemed to pulse with inner light, but she blinked and it was just stone again. Control, she reminded herself. Always control. "Of course, future Luna. I'll clean it immediately." "Good girl." Cassandra stood, brushing imaginary dust from her cream-colored dress. "Though I have to wonder, don't you ever get tired of this? Scrubbing floors like some common human servant?" "It's honest work," Lyra replied, dipping her brush back into the soapy water. "Honest work," one of Cassandra's followers, Melissa Thornfield, repeated mockingly. "Listen to her. As if she has a choice in the matter. As if anyone would give a broken Omega like her anything better," added another. The words stung because they were true. In werewolf society, rank meant everything. Alphas ruled, betas served as their seconds, and omegas, well, omegas were supposed to be the heart of the pack, nurturing and protecting the young, blessed with special gifts of intuition and healing. But what was an omega without a wolf? What was she but a mistake that needed to be contained? Still, Cassandra mused, tapping one perfectly manicured nail against her lips, "I suppose we should be grateful. After all, not everyone gets to witness history in the making." Something in her tone made Lyra look up. Cassandra's smile had taken on a predatory quality that made the space between Lyra's shoulder blades itch with warning. "History?" Lyra asked despite herself. "Oh yes. Haven't you heard? Tomorrow night is the mating ball." Cassandra's eyes gleamed. "The most sacred ceremony in our pack's calendar. Alpha King Kieran Blackwood himself will be attending, along with representatives from all 5 great packs." Lyra's heart skipped. The Alpha King, the most powerful werewolf in existence, ruler of all the packs in their territory. She'd never seen him in person, but the stories painted him as a figure of legend. Dangerous. Untouchable. And completely out of her world. Why are you telling me this? Lyra asked carefully. Because, my dear little Omega, Cassandra said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly to every ear present, you've been specially chosen to entertain our distinguished guests. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. The mating ball was sacred, a night when unmated wolves found their destined partners under the full moon's blessing. For someone like her to even attend would be considered blasphemous. To be asked to entertain. That's not possible, she breathed. Oh, but it is. Cassandra's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. My father thought it would be educational for our guests to see what happens to wolves who disappoint the moon goddess. You're going to sing for them, Lyra. Just like you used to, before you became this pathetic creature. The memory hit her like a tidal wave, dragging her back 3 years to a time when her voice had been her greatest gift. The awakening ceremony had been held in the sacred grove behind the palace, with the entire pack gathered under the full moon's light. Lyra had stood in the center of the ceremonial circle, wearing the traditional white robes of the unblooded, her heart hammering with excitement and terror. Lyra Nightshade, Elder Thorn had intoned, his ancient voice carrying across the silent crowd. Daughter of Beta Marcus and Luna Elena, you come before us on your 19th birthday to receive the moon's blessing and claim your place in the pack. She had nodded, not trusting her voice. Around the circle, her family and friends had watched with expectant faces. Her parents stood with the other betas, pride shining in their eyes. Cassandra had been there too, still her best friend then, offering an encouraging smile. Let the moon see your true form, Elder Thorn commanded. Let your wolf run free. Lyra had closed her eyes and reached for the familiar presence she'd felt stirring within her for months. The wolf that would make her complete, that would show her where she belonged in the pack's hierarchy. But when she reached inward, she found nothing. No wolf. No animal spirit waiting to emerge. Just an empty space where her other half should have been. Panic had clawed at her throat. Around the circle, she could hear whispers starting as the seconds stretched on without transformation. She tried again, pushing deeper, desperately searching for any trace of the wolf she knew had to be there. That's when it happened. Power had exploded out of her like a supernova, not the familiar warmth of wolf magic, but something else entirely. Something that made the air itself sing with harmonics that had no earthly source. The ceremonial torches had flared like stars, every window in the palace had shattered simultaneously, and half the pack had been knocked unconscious by the sheer force of whatever she was. When the chaos settled, she'd found herself kneeling in the center of a circle of destruction, silver chains already being fastened around her wrists by warriors whose faces showed equal parts fear and disgust. Abomination, Elder Thorn had whispered, his aged face pale with horror. The bloodline is cursed. Her parents had disowned her that very night. Earth to the freak show, Cassandra's sharp voice cut through the memory. I asked you a question. Lyra blinked, finding herself back in the palace hallway with 4 pairs of hostile eyes staring down at her. I'm sorry, what? I said, you remember how to sing, don't you? Or has living like an animal made you forget? The casual cruelty of the words made something twist in Lyra's chest. Before her disgrace, her voice had been legendary throughout the territory, a gift that could allegedly soothe savage beasts and heal broken hearts. She'd been destined for greatness, perhaps even to become a Luna herself someday. Now, she couldn't remember the last time she'd sung anything more than a lullaby for the few servants who showed her kindness. I won't do it, she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Cassandra's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, my sweet, stupid little Omega. You will. Because if you don't. She pulled a photograph from her purse, old and creased, but clearly showing a small cabin in the woods where smoke curled from the chimney. Your little human friend Emma won't be getting her medicine much longer. The world tilted. Emma Hartwell was the only person who had shown Lyra genuine kindness since her fall from grace, a human nurse who worked in the Pack's medical facility and had no idea about the supernatural world surrounding her. They'd met during one of Lyra's visits to deliver supplies, and somehow the older woman's gentle nature had broken through Lyra's walls of shame and isolation. When Lyra had learned about Emma's cancer diagnosis 6 months ago, she'd quietly begun using her servants' wages to help pay for treatments the Pack's insurance wouldn't cover. It was the one good thing she'd been able to do with her worthless existence. "You wouldn't," Lyra whispered, but she could smell the truth of Cassandra's threat in the future Luna's scent, satisfaction tinged with cruel anticipation. "Try me." Cassandra tucked the photo back into her purse. "Emma's treatments cost $3,000 a month, don't they? Funny how quickly cancer spreads when you can't afford proper care." The chains around Lyra's wrists flared with heat, and for a moment, she swore she saw sparks dancing between the silver links. One of Cassandra's followers, Sarah Moonwhisper, took a nervous step backward. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered to Melissa. "See what?" Melissa replied, but her voice carried a note of unease. Cassandra's eyes narrowed as she studied Lyra's face. "Interesting. The little Omega still has some spark left." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Tomorrow night, you'll wear something appropriate. We wouldn't want you to outshine the real ladies, would we? And you'll sing whatever I tell you to sing. Are we understood?" Lyra met her gaze, seeing the future Luna's true face beneath the mask of breeding and beauty. Cassandra had always been jealous of Lyra's voice, her natural grace, the attention she'd received from Pack members. The awakening ceremony hadn't just destroyed Lyra's life, it had handed Cassandra everything she'd ever wanted. "I understand," Lyra said quietly. "Excellent." Cassandra straightened, smoothing her dress. "Oh, and Lyra? Don't even think about running. You know we'll find you, and then poor Emma won't be the only one to suffer the consequences." With that, she swept away, her followers trailing behind like perfumed shadows. Their laughter echoed through the corridor long after they disappeared around the corner. Lyra remained kneeling on the marble floor, her hands shaking as she gripped the scrub brush. The chains around her wrists had cooled, but she could still feel residual warmth pulsing through the metal in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Tomorrow night," she thought. "In front of the Alpha King and all the great Packs, they want me to sing." The irony wasn't lost on her. Music had once been her joy, her gift to the world. Now it would be the instrument of her final humiliation. She was so lost in dark thoughts that she almost missed the soft footstep behind her. "Rough morning, child?" Lyra spun around to find an elderly woman standing in the hallway, someone she'd never seen before. The stranger was small and bent with age, her silver hair braided with blue ribbons that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but somehow Lyra felt as though they saw far too much. "I'm sorry," Lyra stammered, scrambling to her feet. "I should get back to work. If you're looking for someone." "I'm exactly where I need to be," the woman said with a smile that revealed teeth that seemed unusually sharp. "You're the one they're planning to humiliate tomorrow night, aren't you?" Lyra's breath caught. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do, dear. The Omega with the pretty voice who's forgotten what she really is." The old woman stepped closer, and Lyra caught a scent that reminded her of wildflowers and ozone, something that didn't quite belong in the sterile palace corridors. "Tell me, child, do you know why you have no wolf?" The question hit like a physical blow. "Because I'm broken. Cursed." The woman's laughter was like wind chimes in a storm. "Oh, my dear child. You're not broken. You're just not what they think you are." "What do you mean?" But even as Lyra asked the question, the old woman was backing away, that strange smile still playing around her lips. "When you sing tomorrow night," she said, her voice carrying despite the growing distance between them, "remember that the moon sees all truths, even those we hide from ourselves." "Wait!" Lyra called, but the woman had already turned the corner. When Lyra hurried after her, the hallway was empty, no trace of silver hair or blue ribbons, only the lingering scent of wildflowers that faded even as she breathed it in. What they think you are, the woman's words echoed in her mind. What did that mean? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of cleaning and preparation. The palace was in chaos getting ready for the mating ball, with servants scurrying like ants through the corridors, polishing already pristine surfaces and arranging flowers that cost more than most people's monthly wages. Lyra kept her head down and her mouth shut, but she couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious woman's words. Or about the way her chains had flared with heat when Cassandra threatened Emma. Or about the sparks that had danced between the silver links when her anger peaked. The suppressant chains were supposed to contain any supernatural abilities completely. So why did she keep feeling more? Evening came too quickly. As Lyra made her way back to the servants' quarters, her steps grew heavier with each stride. Tomorrow night, she would stand before the most powerful wolves in existence and perform like a trained animal for their amusement. Her small room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a rickety dresser, but it was private, the one blessing of being treated like a pariah. She pulled the key from around her neck and unlocked the door, stepping into shadows that felt like refuge after a day of hostile stares. On her bed lay a dress. Lyra's breath caught as she stared at the garment. It was clearly old, the kind of thing that might have been worn by servants decades ago. The fabric was a dull brown that had faded with age, and she could see patches where careful mending had tried to hide worn spots. A deliberate insult, she realized. While every other woman at the ball would glitter in designer gowns that cost fortunes, she would wear rags that marked her as inferior to everyone present. But as she lifted the dress to examine it more closely, something strange happened. For just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, the fabric seemed to shimmer. Instead of faded brown, she saw silver that flowed like liquid moonlight, elegant and beautiful and somehow alive with inner radiance. She blinked, and it was just an old servant's dress again. I'm losing my mind, she thought, but even as she told herself that, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. The mysterious woman's words, the heat in her chains, the sparks she'd seen, it all pointed to something larger stirring beneath the surface of her constrained existence. She hung the dress on a peg and sank onto her narrow bed, staring at her hands. They looked ordinary enough, pale from lack of sunlight, bearing the calluses of hard work. But wrapped around her wrists were the silver chains that had defined her life for 3 years. The moon sees all truths, the woman had said. Tomorrow night, the full moon would shine down on the mating ball. Tomorrow night, she would be forced to sing before an audience that expected her humiliation. But as Lyra sat in the growing darkness of her small room, a thought began to form, dangerous and thrilling and completely insane. They expected her to sing the song of a broken Omega, a creature defeated by circumstance and cruel fate. But what if she sang something else entirely? What if, for the first time in 3 years, she sang the truth? The decision crystallized in her mind like ice forming on water, beautiful, sharp, and absolutely irreversible. She would sing tomorrow night. But not the song they expected. She would sing the song that had been building in her chest for 3 long years, the song of everything she'd lost, everything she'd endured, and everything she might still become. Even if it destroyed her completely, she would give them a performance they would never forget. The chains around her wrists pulsed once with silver light, as if responding to her resolve. Tomorrow night, she promised herself as darkness settled over the Moonstone Palace, everything would change. Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel. Chapter 2. Dawn came too early and too bright, streaming through the narrow window of Lyra's chamber like an unwelcome herald of the day she'd been dreading. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with the decision she'd made in the darkness, a decision that felt both inevitable and utterly reckless in the harsh light of morning. The palace was already alive with frantic energy. From her window, she could see servants rushing across the courtyard below, their arms full of flowers and linens and all the countless details that went into preparing for the most important social event of the year. The mating ball wasn't just a celebration, it was politics, tradition, and hope all wrapped into one magical night where destinies were decided and futures sealed. And she was going to destroy it all. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a strange calm that settled in her bones like winter frost. For 3 years, she'd lived at the mercy of others' cruelty, accepting their judgment, bowing to their will. Tonight, for the first time since her disgrace, she would be the one in control. A sharp knock at her door shattered her reverie. Omega. You're needed in the kitchens. Lyra sighed and pulled on her plain work dress, the servant's uniform that marked her status as clearly as the chains around her wrists. The day passed in a blur of preparation, polishing silver that already gleamed, arranging flowers that were already perfect, and scrubbing surfaces that didn't need cleaning. All busy work designed to keep the lower servants occupied while the real preparations happened in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. But even in the kitchens, she couldn't escape the building excitement. The cook, Mrs. Pemberton, a plump woman who'd always shown Lyra small kindnesses, was practically vibrating with anticipation. They say the Alpha King's convoy was spotted at dawn, she whispered to anyone who would listen. 3 dozen vehicles, all black as midnight. And the other great pack started arriving before sunrise. Lyra's hand stilled on the silver platter she'd been polishing. The Alpha King. Tonight, she would stand before the most powerful werewolf in existence and, what? Sing her heart out? Reveal whatever power had been locked away inside her? The reality of what she planned to do hit her like a physical blow. You all right, dear? Mrs. Pemberton had noticed her pallor. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Lyra managed. Just tired. But she wasn't fine. As the day wore on, she began to feel something building inside her, a pressure that made her skin feel too tight and her breathing shallow. The chains around her wrists grew warm, then cool, then warm again, as if responding to some internal rhythm she couldn't identify. By afternoon, the first of the great packs had arrived. Lyra was in the main corridor, dusting portraits of long-dead alphas, when the Silvercrest delegation swept through the palace doors. She recognized them immediately, wolves from the northern territories, their pale hair and ice-blue eyes marking them as clearly as any banner. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their expensive clothes unable to hide the lethal power that radiated from each of them. But it was the woman at their head who made Lyra's breath catch. She was ancient, that much was clear despite her apparent middle age. Power clung to her like perfume, and when her gaze swept the corridor, Lyra felt it like a physical touch. For just a moment, those pale eyes locked on hers, and the woman's lips curved in a smile that revealed teeth just a fraction too sharp. Then they were gone, swept away by protocol and ceremony, leaving only the lingering scent of pine forests and old snow. The Iron Maw pack arrived next, their massive forms and scarred faces speaking of a territory where only the strongest survived. Then came the Stormclaw delegation, crackling with an energy that made the air itself seem to hum. The Blood Moon pack followed, their red-tinged hair and amber eyes marking them as descendants of the old war packs. But it was the final arrival that brought the palace to a complete standstill. Lyra was standing near the grand windows of the East Wing when the convoy appeared on the horizon. Even from a distance, the vehicles looked like something out of a fever dream, sleek black shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, moving in perfect formation across the landscape. The Alpha King, someone whispered behind her, and the words rippled through the gathered servants like wildfire. Alpha King Kieran Blackwood. The most powerful werewolf in existence. The man who'd claimed his throne at 19 by defeating 3 challenger alphas in a single night. The ruler whose territory spanned half the continent and whose word was law for millions of supernatural beings. And according to every story Lyra had ever heard, he was still unmated at 29, a fact that made him the most sought-after male in the supernatural world. The convoy swept through the palace gates with military precision, and Lyra found herself pressed against the window with a dozen other servants, all trying to catch a glimpse of legend-made flesh. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the main entrance, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and Alpha King Kieran Blackwood stepped out into the afternoon light. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. He was magnificent. There was no other word for it. Tall and broad-shouldered, with midnight black hair that caught the sunlight like silk and storm-gray eyes that seemed to see everything at once. He wore a simple black suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year, but it was the way he moved that marked him as royalty, with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. But it was what she saw beneath the power that made her heart clench unexpectedly. Loneliness. It clung to him like a shadow, so profound that even from her distant window, she could feel the weight of it. His gaze swept the assembled crowd with detached interest, but she caught the way it lingered on the couples among the other pack representatives, the brief tightening around his eyes that spoke of a yearning he probably didn't even acknowledge to himself. He was searching for something. Someone. His mate. The realization hit her like lightning, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. This man, this king, was still alone despite having the power to claim any woman he desired. The stories made him sound like a conquering god, all power and ruthless authority. They never mentioned the sadness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. As if sensing her scrutiny, his head turned toward the window where she stood. Their eyes met across the distance, and the world stopped. Those storm-gray eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her knees weak, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, she felt something stir deep in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the power that had been locked away and everything to do with recognition so fundamental it felt like coming home. Then someone jostled her shoulder, breaking the connection, and when she looked again, he was already turning away, surrounded by his entourage as they swept into the palace. But her hands were shaking, and the chains around her wrists were humming with an energy that made her skin tingle. What was that? Magnificent, isn't he? Lyra spun to find the elderly woman from yesterday standing beside her, though this time she looked different. The bent posture was still there, the silver hair still braided with those strange blue ribbons, but her clouded eyes seemed clearer, more focused. You, Lyra breathed. Who are you? Just an old woman who came with the Silvercrest delegation, she replied with that same enigmatic smile. Though I suspect you're beginning to understand that not everything is as it appears. The other servants had dispersed, leaving them alone by the window. The woman stepped closer, and again Lyra caught that scent of wildflowers and ozone, something that didn't belong in the sterile palace air. Tell me, child, the woman continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, when you looked at him just now, what did you feel? Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks. I don't know what you mean. Of course you do. The woman's smile widened, revealing those two sharp teeth. You felt it, didn't you? That pull. That recognition. Your soul calling to its other half. That's impossible, Lyra whispered, but even as she said it, she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. I'm nobody. A broken Omega. And he's the Alpha King, the woman finished. Yes, I noticed. Tell me, dear, what do you know about mate bonds? Everyone knows about mate bonds. Lyra glanced around nervously, but they were still alone. When two wolves are destined for each other, they feel the pull. The recognition. But it only works between. She trailed off as the implications hit her. Between wolves, the woman said gently. Yes. Which is why you've never felt it before, isn't it? Because you don't have a wolf to recognize her mate. Because I'm broken, Lyra said automatically. No, child. The woman reached out as if to touch her cheek, then pulled back at the last moment. Because you're something else entirely. Something that makes the mate bond work differently. Stronger. Before Lyra could ask what she meant, the woman was already backing away, melting into the shadows of the corridor with that same impossible grace she'd shown the day before. Wait. Lyra called, but she was already gone, leaving only the lingering scent of wildflowers and 1,000 questions Lyra had no way to answer. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of preparation and growing dread. As evening approached, the palace transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers blazed with thousands of candles, filling the corridors with warm, dancing light. Garlands of silver flowers, Luna's breath, sacred to their kind, draped every surface, their ethereal glow adding to the magical atmosphere. But it was the ballroom itself that took Lyra's breath away. She'd been tasked with final preparations, which meant she had the privilege of seeing the space in all its glory before the guests arrived. The massive room had been transformed into something that belonged in dreams rather than reality. Thousands of white roses cascaded from the ceiling, their petals scattered across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across every surface, while the floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the rising full moon in all its glory. At the far end of the room, a dais had been erected for the most important guests, the alphas and their potential mates. 5 ornate chairs were arranged in a semicircle, with a 6th chair in the center that was clearly meant for the Alpha King himself. It was carved from black wood and inlaid with silver, a throne fit for the ruler of their kind. Beautiful, isn't it? Lyra turned to find Cassandra approaching, resplendent in a gown of gold silk that matched her blonde hair perfectly. She looked like a goddess of sunlight, all radiant beauty and cold perfection. It's magnificent, Lyra admitted. It should be. Father spared no expense. Cassandra's green eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. After all, this could be the night I catch the Alpha King's attention. Imagine, me as the queen of all werewolves. The thought made something twist painfully in Lyra's chest, though she couldn't have said why. Of course, Cassandra continued, circling Lyra like a predator stalking prey. First we have our little entertainment. Are you ready to perform, Omega? Lyra lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. I'm ready. Good. Cassandra's smile was razor-sharp. Because our guests are beginning to arrive, and they're so looking forward to seeing the famous failure of the Moonstone Pack. As if summoned by her words, the great doors of the ballroom swung open, and the guests began to flow in. Lyra had never seen so much beauty and power gathered in one place. The unmated wolves came dressed in their finest, the men in sharp tuxedos that emphasized their supernatural strength, the women in gowns that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. They moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, all deadly elegance and barely leashed power. But it was when the Alpha King entered that the very air in the room seemed to change. He stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the assembled crowd with those storm-gray eyes, and every conversation died to whispers. Even among this gathering of supernatural elite, his presence was commanding, magnetic in a way that drew every gaze like iron filings to a magnet. He'd changed from his travel clothes into formal evening wear, a black tuxedo that fit him like it had been tailored by angels and probably had been. But it was the way he moved that marked him as royalty, with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place at the top of the food chain. As he made his way to the dais, wolves throughout the room bowed their heads in respect. Even the other alphas, powerful beings in their own right, showed deference to their king. But as his gaze swept the crowd, Lyra saw that same searching quality she'd noticed earlier. His eyes moved from face to face, as if looking for something he'd given up hope of finding. Until his gaze found hers. This time, the connection was even stronger. Across the crowded ballroom, through hundreds of other wolves, his storm-gray eyes locked on her violet ones with an intensity that made her knees buckle. She saw his entire body go still, his nostrils flaring as if catching a scent that called to something primal in his nature. Recognition blazed in his eyes, recognition and something that looked almost like relief. Then Alpha Marcus stepped forward, his voice magically amplified to carry across the vast space. My lords and ladies, he announced, his tone carrying the authority of command, welcome to the Moonstone Pack's annual mating ball. Before we begin the sacred ceremonies, we have prepared special entertainment for your enjoyment. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned toward where Lyra stood at the edge of the room. She could smell their emotions, curiosity, anticipation, and underneath it all, a hunger for spectacle that made her stomach turn. Some of you may remember, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone that carried clearly to every ear, the Omega who was once part of our pack's nobility. Tonight, she honors us with a performance. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Even those who lived for centuries had heard the story of the Beta's daughter who'd failed so spectacularly at her awakening ceremony. Some wolves laughed outright, while others looked uncomfortable with the cruelty of using someone's disgrace as entertainment. But on the dais, the Alpha King's expression didn't change. His eyes remained locked on Lyra with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. Go on, Cassandra hissed, appearing at Lyra's shoulder to push her toward the center of the ballroom. Give them a show. Lyra walked slowly toward the designated spot, her worn servant's dress a stark contrast to the glittering gowns around her. The crowd parted to form a circle, their faces ranging from amused to cruel to merely curious. She could smell their anticipation, they expected her humiliation, her breakdown, her final defeat. But as she took her place in the center of the circle, as hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on her with hungry expectation, Lyra felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Power. It started as a whisper in her chest, a flutter of energy that made the chains around her wrists grow warm. The sensation built slowly, like water gathering behind a dam, pressing against the barriers that had contained it for so long. She looked up at the dais, meeting the Alpha King's gaze one more time. In those storm-gray depths, she saw something that gave her courage, not mockery or cruel amusement, but genuine interest. As if he sensed that whatever was about to happen would be far from ordinary. Taking a deep breath, Lyra opened her mouth and let the first note escape. The sound that emerged was nothing like what the assembled wolves expected. Instead of the broken lament of a defeated Omega, it was pure and clear and filled with a power that seemed to resonate in the very bones of everyone present. And above her, the crystal chandeliers began to hum in harmony. The sound started as barely a whisper, crystal responding to crystal, but as her voice rose, the harmonics grew stronger. Light began to dance within the prisms, casting rainbows that had no earthly source across the silent crowd. But it was the Alpha King's reaction that made her breath catch. He was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that the wood was splintering beneath his fingers, his storm-gray eyes wide with something that looked almost like recognition. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. And in that moment, as her voice soared toward notes that should have been impossible for any throat to produce, Lyra finally understood what the mysterious woman had been trying to tell her. She wasn't broken. She was something else entirely. Something that made the mate bond burn like fire in her veins and turned crystal chandeliers into instruments of magic. As her song built toward its crescendo, she saw the Alpha King rise from his throne, his eyes never leaving her face. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel. Chapter 3. The second note that flowed from Lyra's throat carried with it the weight of 3 years' worth of suppressed emotion, pain, longing, and a power that had been desperately trying to break free. As her voice climbed higher, something extraordinary began to happen. The worn servant's dress she wore started to shimmer. At first, it was subtle, a glimmer here and there as if moonbeams had gotten caught in the faded brown fabric. But as her song gained strength, the transformation became undeniable. Threads of silver light began weaving through the material, each note seeming to pull more radiance from some otherworldly source. The assembled wolves watched in stunned silence as the threadbare garment dissolved and reformed before their eyes, brown fading to pewter, then to silver, until finally it became something that belonged in dreams rather than reality. The dress now flowed around her like liquid moonlight, catching and reflecting the glow of the chandeliers above until she seemed to be clothed in starfire itself. But it was her voice that held them all captive. She sang without words, in a language that predated civilization, a melody that spoke directly to the soul rather than the mind. The song told of longing that stretched across centuries, of power hidden in shadows, of truths buried so deep they'd been forgotten by the world itself. It spoke of wolves running free under ancient skies, when magic flowed as freely as water and the barriers between realms were gossamer thin. Every wolf in the ballroom felt it differently. The younger ones swayed on their feet, their eyes glazing as they lost themselves in the ethereal melody. The elders felt memories stirring, half-remembered legends their grandparents had whispered in the dark. And the alphas felt something that made their wolves pace restlessly beneath their human skins, recognizing a call to something primal and magnificent. The crystal chandeliers overhead resonated with increasing intensity, their harmonic chimes joining her voice in a symphony that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Light danced within each crystal prism, casting rainbows that moved with liquid grace across the marble floors and silk-draped walls. But it was the Alpha King's reaction that made the breath catch in every throat. Kieran Blackwood, the most powerful werewolf in existence, the man who had never bowed to anyone, was slowly rising from his throne. His storm-gray eyes were locked on Lyra with an intensity that made the air between them crackle with electric tension. His hands gripped the arms of his chair until the wood splintered and cracked, his breathing becoming ragged as her song seemed to reach inside his chest and squeeze his heart. "Impossible," he whispered, but the word was lost in the ethereal music that filled every corner of the vast ballroom. As Lyra's voice soared toward notes that should have been beyond human capability, something even more extraordinary began to manifest. The moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to respond to her call, growing brighter and more intense until it formed a visible column of silver radiance around her. Within that pillar of light, she began to change. Her auburn hair lightened strand by strand, transforming to silver white that seemed to hold its own luminescence. Her violet eyes began to glow with inner fire, and her pale skin took on a quality that made her appear lit from within. But most breathtaking of all, from her shoulder blades, gossamer wings of pure moonlight began to unfurl, not solid flesh and bone, but constructs of the same ethereal radiance that surrounded her. Gasps echoed through the crowd, but no one moved. They couldn't. The song held them all in thrall, wolves and werewolves alike frozen in wonder at a sight none of them had ever dreamed they'd witness. "By the goddess," someone breathed, and the reverent whisper seemed to break whatever paralysis had held the assembled nobility. But instead of backing away in fear, every unmated male in the room took a step forward, their eyes fixed on Lyra with expressions of awe and desperate longing. Even some of the mated wolves seemed affected, their gazes growing distant as ancient instincts warred with modern bonds. That's when Cassandra's carefully laid plans began to crumble. The future Luna had been watching from the edge of the crowd, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as she realized that her moment of triumph was becoming Lyra's revelation. Every eye in the room that should have been admiring her golden beauty was instead fixed on the transformed Omega who glowed like a fallen star. "Stop her," Cassandra hissed to her father, but Alpha Marcus seemed as entranced as the rest, his usual commanding presence reduced to that of a man caught in a dream he didn't want to wake from. The song built to a crescendo that seemed to make the palace itself vibrate in harmony. The chandeliers chimed with increasing urgency, their crystal voices joining Lyra's in a chorus that was both beautiful and otherworldly. Light poured from every surface, the walls, the floors, even the air itself seemed to sparkle with contained starlight. And then, just as her voice reached its peak, Alpha King Kieran Blackwood did something that would be talked about for generations to come. He fell to his knees. The most powerful wolf in existence, the Alpha King who commanded the loyalty of millions, dropped to his knees in the center of the ballroom floor, his storm-gray eyes never leaving Lyra's luminous form. "Luna," he breathed, and the word carried on the supernatural acoustics of her song to every ear in the room. The moment he spoke, everything changed. The silver chains around Lyra's wrists, chains that had been forged with ancient magic specifically to suppress supernatural abilities, began to crack. Fissures of light seeped through the metal, growing brighter with each note until they looked like captured lightning. The transformation wasn't just physical anymore. Power radiated from her invisible waves, like heat shimmer on a summer day, and the wolves closest to her took instinctive steps backward as their supernatural senses recognized something beyond their understanding. Her song reached its absolute peak, and the chains exploded. The suppressors shattered in a shower of silver sparks and twisted metal, the pieces dissolving into motes of light before they could hit the ground. The moment the magical bonds were broken, Lyra's voice soared even higher, carrying notes that seemed to resonate with the fundamental forces of creation itself. The crystal chandeliers couldn't contain the harmonics anymore. One by one, they began to shatter, but instead of falling as deadly rain, the crystal fragments danced in the air around the assembled wolves, creating a curtain of rainbow light that turned the ballroom into something out of mythology. And in the center of it all, Lyra's song finally came to an end. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle tinkling of crystal shards as they settled to the marble floor like fallen snow. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, taking in the gossamer wings that still stretched from her shoulders, the silver white hair that moved with its own ethereal breeze, the violet eyes that glowed with inner starfire. She was beautiful. She was terrifying. She was impossible. She was no Omega at all. "What?" someone whispered, but the word died unfinished as no one seemed capable of completing the thought. That's when the elderly woman from the Silvercrest delegation stepped forward, and as she did, her appearance began to change. The bent posture straightened, the clouded eyes cleared to reveal depths that spoke of centuries, and the simple servant's clothes shifted to reveal robes that seemed to be cut from the night sky itself. Power radiated from her in waves that made even the Alpha King look up from where he knelt, his expression shifting to one of wary respect. "Elder Moira," Kieran said, his voice rough with emotion. "What is she?" The ancient woman, Elder Moira, smiled, and when she did, her two sharp teeth were clearly visible to the entire assembly. "She is what hasn't been seen for over 1,000 years, Your Majesty. What the old legend spoke of but never truly expected to witness again." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying easily through the vast space despite its quiet tone. "Behold a moon daughter, born of lunar magic and starlight, touched by the goddess herself." The words hit the assembled wolves like a physical blow. Moon daughters were legend, beings of such power and rarity that they existed more in myth than memory. The last one had died centuries before any of them had been born, and most had begun to believe they were nothing more than stories told to children. "That's impossible," Cassandra protested, her voice shrill with desperation. "Moon daughters are myths. Stories to frighten." "Myths, are they?" Elder Moira's laugh was like silver bells in a winter wind. "Then explain what you've just witnessed. Explain how an Omega with no wolf could command the very elements, could make crystals sing in harmony with her voice, could break suppressor chains that have contained magical beings for centuries." She gestured toward Lyra, who still stood in the column of moonlight, her gossamer wings slowly folding against her back as the immediate surge of power began to settle. "Moon daughters were the bridge between our world and the realm of pure magic," Elder Moira continued, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient ritual. "They were born perhaps once in a millennium, always to bloodlines that carried the old gifts, always when the world had greatest need of them." As she spoke, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some wolves dropped to their knees in reverence, while others backed toward the exits in fear. The political implications alone were staggering. A moon daughter had power that could reshape the supernatural world, could tip the balance between the great packs, could change everything they thought they knew about magic itself. But before anyone could fully process what they'd witnessed, before the assembled nobility could decide whether to worship or flee, a new sound reached their ears from outside the palace. The thundering of hooves. The howls of an army. And underneath it all, a darkness that seemed to drain the very light from the moon itself. Alpha Marcus rushed to the windows, his face paling at what he saw in the distance. Hundreds of shapes moved across the landscape, wolves, but wrong somehow, their eyes glowing red in the darkness instead of the normal gold or amber. At their head rode a figure on horseback whose very presence seemed to make shadows deeper and moonlight dimmer. "We're under attack," Marcus announced, his voice carrying barely contained panic. "The Shadow Pack has come." Fear rippled through the ballroom like wildfire. The Shadow Pack was legend too, but the kind of legend that parents used to terrify children into obedience. They were wolves who had given up their souls for power, creatures of darkness who served masters that existed beyond the normal world. "Alpha Malachar," Elder Moira whispered, and for the first time since revealing herself, fear crept into her ancient voice. "He knows what she is. He's come to claim her." As if summoned by his name, a voice boomed across the night, magically amplified and filled with dark promise that made every wolf in the ballroom shiver with primal fear. "Give me the moon daughter, and I will spare your lives," the voice commanded, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Refuse, and watch your pack burn beneath the shadow of my wrath." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Wolves scrambled toward exits and windows, their earlier reverence replaced by pure survival instinct. Alphas barked orders at their delegations while Lunas gathered their unmated daughters close, trying to shield them from whatever was coming. But Alpha King Kieran Blackwood rose from his knees with deadly grace, his own power flaring as his eyes began to glow with golden fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had never backed down from a fight. "No one," he said, the words cutting through the chaos like a blade, "touches what is mine." The declaration hit Lyra like a physical blow. "Mine." The word resonated in her chest with a truth that made her newly awakened power sing in response. The mate bond that had been building between them throughout the evening crystallized in that moment, snapping into place with a force that made them both stagger. She was his. He was hers. And he would protect her with his life. But even as that realization settled in her heart, the east wall of the ballroom exploded inward in a shower of stone and mortar. Through the breach poured creatures of nightmare, wolves whose eyes burned like coals and whose forms seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And at their head strode a figure that made even the bravest alphas take a step back in fear. Alpha Malachar was tall and lean, with silver hair that moved as if it had its own wind and skin so pale it was nearly translucent. But it was his eyes that marked him as something other than wolf, completely black, without iris or pupil, like windows into the void itself. "Ah," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of chaos and terror, "there she is. The lost little lamb who doesn't know she's actually a dragon." His void-black gaze fixed on Lyra with an intensity that made ice form in her veins, and when he smiled, his teeth were far too sharp and far too numerous for any earthly creature. "Hello, Moon Daughter," Alpha Malachar said, stepping delicately over the rubble as his shadow pack fanned out behind him. "I've been waiting a very long time to meet you. Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel." Chapter 4. The rubble from the destroyed wall was still settling when Alpha Malachar stepped fully into the ballroom, and Lyra felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. This wasn't the chill of winter air flowing through the breach, this was something far more fundamental, as if his very presence drained the warmth from everything around him. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was something wrong about it, something that made every supernatural instinct in the room scream warnings. Where normal wolves radiated life and vitality, Malachar seemed to absorb it, leaving shadows in his wake that were deeper and colder than they had any right to be. "Magnificent," he said, his void-black eyes drinking in Lyra's transformed appearance with an appreciation that made her skin crawl. "Even more beautiful than the prophecies foretold. Do you know, Moon Daughter, how long I've been waiting for this moment?" Behind him, his shadow pack fanned out through the destroyed wall, creatures that had once been wolves but were now something else entirely. Their eyes burned red in faces that were too angular, too sharp, and their movements held the same wrongness as their alpha. They were the stuff of nightmares given form, and their very presence made the air thick with malevolent energy. But it was Kieran who moved first. The transformation that overtook the Alpha King was like watching lightning given flesh. His human form dissolved with supernatural speed, replaced by a massive black wolf that was easily twice the size of any normal werewolf. His eyes blazed with golden fire, and power radiated from him in waves that made the broken crystal on the floor tremble. He launched himself at Malachar with deadly intent, but the Shadow Alpha moved like liquid darkness, flowing around the attack with inhuman grace. When he struck back, his claws left trails of shadow in the air, not just darkness, but actual void that seemed to drink light from everything it touched. "Impressive," Malachar said as he danced away from another of Kieran's attacks. "But you're fighting for the wrong side, young king. She belongs with her own kind." "She belongs with her mate," Kieran snarled, his wolf form rippling with barely contained fury. Around them, the ballroom had erupted into chaos. The other alphas present had shifted to their wolf forms and were engaging the shadow pack with vicious intensity, but even their combined strength was barely holding the line. These weren't ordinary enemies. The shadow wolves fought with a coordination that spoke of hive mind tactics, and their unnatural speed made them difficult to track, let alone strike. Elder Moira had also revealed her true nature, shifting into a wolf form that was far larger than her elderly human appearance had suggested. Her silver fur seemed to sparkle with stardust, and her fangs gleamed like captured moonbeams as she fought alongside two other Silvercrest wolves in a display of coordination that spoke of pack bonds forged over decades. But for all their skill and power, they were outnumbered 3-1. Lyra stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her gossamer wings folded against her back as she watched the battle rage around her. The power that had awakened during her song still thrummed in her veins, but she had no idea how to use it, no training in the arts that should have been her birthright. That's when she noticed the woman. She stood at the edge of the battle, seemingly untouched by the violence swirling around her, and there was something about her presence that made Lyra's breath catch. She was tall and regal, with midnight black hair that seemed to absorb light and eyes the color of starlight. Unlike everyone else in the ballroom, she appeared completely calm, as if supernatural warfare was merely an inconvenience. "You're not responsible for their choices, child," the woman said, and somehow her voice carried clearly to Lyra's ears despite the sounds of battle. Lyra spun toward her, taking in the stranger's ethereal beauty and the power that radiated from her in subtle waves. "Who are you?" "A friend," the woman replied, stepping closer with movements that were too fluid, too graceful for any earthly creature. "One who has been waiting a very long time for you to awaken." She gestured toward the battle, where Kieran was being slowly driven back despite his incredible strength and skill. Shadow Pack wolves were falling, but so were members of the great packs, and the scent of blood was thick in the air. "Your mate fights bravely," the woman continued, "but he cannot win this alone. Malakar is older than any of them realize, and his power draws from sources they don't understand." Even as she spoke, Lyra could see the truth of her words. Kieran, despite his incredible strength, was taking damage. Dark wounds marked his black fur where Malakar's void claws had found their mark, and his movements were becoming more labored with each exchange. "What can I do?" Lyra asked desperately. "I don't even understand what I am, let alone how to control it." The mysterious woman smiled, and when she did, Lyra caught a glimpse of something that made her breath catch: fangs, but not the normal canines of a werewolf. These were different, more delicate but somehow more frightening. Vampire, Lyra realized with a shock. But not just any vampire, the power radiating from this woman was ancient beyond measure, speaking of centuries, perhaps millennia, of accumulated strength. "You sang once tonight and revealed your true nature," the woman said gently. "Sing again, and discover your true power." "But I don't know how." "You know," the woman interrupted, her starlight eyes holding depths that seemed to contain the wisdom of ages. "Deep down, in the part of yourself that remembers running under stars that no longer shine, you know exactly what to do." Before Lyra could ask what she meant, a cry of pain cut through the noise of battle. Kieran had been caught by a coordinated attack from 3 shadow wolves, and dark blood was streaming down his side. Without thinking, Lyra stepped forward. "Enough," she cried, and her voice carried a power that made every wolf in the ballroom, friend and foe alike, freeze in place. The column of moonlight that had surrounded her during her first song returned, but this time it was brighter, more intense. The gossamer wings spread wider, and as they did, silver light began to emanate from them in waves that washed over the assembled combatants. But this time, her song was different. Where her first performance had been one of longing and revelation, this was a song of command. Her voice rose in notes that seemed to resonate with the fundamental forces of creation itself, carrying power that had slept for 1,000 years and was finally awakening. The moonlight streaming through the shattered windows intensified until it was almost blindingly bright, and every surface in the ballroom began to glow with reflected radiance. But it was the effect on the combatants that was truly extraordinary. The wolves of the great packs found themselves bathed in silver light that seemed to heal their wounds even as it gave them renewed strength. Cuts closed, broken bones mended, and exhaustion fled before the tide of lunar magic that flowed from Lyra's voice. The Shadow Pack, however, reacted very differently. They began to scream. The red glow in their eyes flickered and dimmed as Lyra's lunar magic washed over them like holy water on unhallowed ground. Several of the lesser shadow wolves actually began to dissolve, their forms unable to maintain cohesion in the face of such pure celestial power. Even Malakar staggered, his void black eyes widening in what might have been surprise or even fear. "Impossible," he breathed, his voice carrying despite the ethereal music that filled the air. "She's untrained. Unaware. She shouldn't be able to channel that much." His words were cut off as Lyra's song reached a new crescendo, and the moon itself seemed to respond. Through the destroyed wall, additional moonbeams lanced down like spears of silver light, each one seeking out a shadow wolf and pinning them in place with celestial fire. But the effort was taking its toll on Lyra. She could feel power flowing out of her like a river, and the vampire woman beside her seemed to sense her growing weakness. "Not alone, child," the woman said softly, stepping up beside her. "Never alone." And then she began to sing as well. Her voice was different from Lyra's, older, carrying harmonics that spoke of centuries of accumulated power and wisdom. But when it blended with Lyra's lunar song, the result was devastating to their enemies. The combined power of their voices was like a hurricane of light and sound. Shadow wolves throughout the ballroom began to retreat toward the breach in the wall, dragging their wounded with them as Lyra's purifying magic stripped away the darkness that sustained them. But it was the revelation of what the vampire woman truly was that made even Elder Moira's eyes widen in shock. As she sang, her appearance began to shift. The simple elegance of her dress transformed into robes that seemed to be cut from the night sky itself, complete with patterns of stars that moved and sparkled with their own light. A circlet of silver appeared on her brow, set with gems that pulsed in rhythm with her voice. Royalty, Lyra realized through the haze of power and music. This wasn't just any vampire, this was vampire royalty. The combined assault of lunar and vampiric magic was more than the Shadow Pact could withstand. Malakar's forces began a fighting retreat toward the breach, their formation crumbling under the relentless pressure of purifying light. But Malakar himself wasn't finished. With a roar that shook the palace to its foundations, the Shadow Alpha underwent his own transformation. His human form dissolved into something that was part wolf, part shadow, and part nightmare. His size rivaled Kieran's, but where the Alpha King radiated golden power, Malakar seemed to devour light itself. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, his voice now distorted by his monstrous form. "You're still nothing but a child playing with forces beyond your comprehension." He gestured to his remaining forces, and shadows seemed to pour from every corner of the ballroom, wrapping around the retreating shadow wolves like living things. In moments, they were gone, leaving only the devastation of their attack and the lingering scent of something that definitely wasn't of this world. But before he disappeared entirely, Malakar's void-black gaze fixed on Lyra with an intensity that made her stumble in her song. "I know what you are, Moon Daughter," he said, his words carrying despite the fading echoes of her music. "More importantly, I know what you're destined to become. The power you've tasted tonight is just the beginning. There are depths to your abilities that even you cannot imagine." His horrible smile revealed teeth like obsidian daggers. "And when that awakening comes, when you realize the full scope of what you can accomplish, you will seek me out willingly. Because I alone can give you what you'll need." "What are you talking about?" Lyra demanded, but he was already fading into shadow. "Ask your vampire friend about the convergence," Malakar called, his voice growing distant as the darkness consumed him. "Ask her what happens when a moon daughter reaches her full power. Ask her why they called the last one the destroyer of worlds." With that cryptic warning, he vanished entirely, taking the last of his shadow pack with him. As Lyra's song finally faded, she collapsed to her knees, completely drained. The gossamer wings dissolved back into moonlight, and her appearance returned to its human normal, though she noticed that her hair remained silver white rather than its original auburn. Strong arms caught her before she could hit the ground, and she looked up to see Kieran in human form once again, his storm-gray eyes dark with concern. The wounds from Malakar's claws were already healing, leaving only faint silver scars that somehow made him look even more dangerous. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "Is everyone?" she began weakly. "Alive," he confirmed, though his expression remained grim. "Thanks to you." Around them, the ballroom was a disaster zone. Crystal shards covered the marble floor like deadly snow, the east wall was completely destroyed, and scorch marks from various magical attacks decorated the remaining surfaces. But the assembled wolves were indeed alive, though many bore wounds that would take days to fully heal despite her magical intervention. Elder Moira approached, her expression grave as she surveyed the destruction. "Your Majesty," she said to Kieran, "we have a problem. What happened here tonight, word will spread. Every supernatural creature in existence will now know that a moon daughter has awakened." She turned her ancient gaze to Lyra, who was still cradled in Kieran's protective embrace. "And not all of them will be as civilized as Malakar in their approach to claiming you." The vampire woman materialized beside them as if stepping out of shadow itself, her royal robes fading back into the simple elegance she'd worn earlier. "The child needs training," she said simply, her starlight eyes holding depths of concern. And protection. I can provide the first, but for the second. Her gaze fixed on Kieran with an intensity that made him straighten. That will be up to you, Alpha King. Kieran's arm tightened protectively around Lyra, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never failed to protect what mattered to him. She'll have both, he said. But first, I think it's time for some introductions. He looked down at Lyra with an expression that was equal parts awe, possessiveness, and something deeper, something that made her heart race despite her exhaustion. Hello, mate, he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that chased away the lingering chill of Malakar's presence. My name is Kieran Blackwood, and it seems I've been waiting my entire life to meet you. As dawnlight began to creep through the destroyed ballroom windows, Lyra realized that her old life was truly over. The servants' chains, the years of humiliation, the careful isolation, all of it had led to this moment. But Elder Moira's next words chilled her to the bone. I'm afraid Malakar was right about one thing, the ancient wolf said quietly. This was just the beginning. There are forces stirring in the darkness, things that make the Shadow Pack look like children playing with matches. And they're all coming for her. The vampire woman nodded grimly. The convergence hasn't begun yet, but the signs are already manifesting. We have perhaps weeks before every supernatural power in existence descends upon us. Then we'd better get started, Kieran said, his voice carrying the steel of absolute determination. Because whatever's coming, they'll have to go through me first. As the sun rose over the devastated palace, painting the ruins in shades of gold and amber, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that Malakar's words had been more prophecy than threat. What happens when a moon daughter reaches her full power? Why did they call the last one the destroyer of worlds? And most terrifying of all, what if he was right about her seeking him out willingly? Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel. Chapter 5. The Alpha King's private study was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, far removed from the opulent chaos of the destroyed ballroom. Ancient books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings worn smooth by centuries of handling, while artifacts that spoke of power and history occupied places of honor on heavy oak shelves. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive in the pre-dawn darkness. Lyra sat curled in an oversized chair that dwarfed her slight frame, still wearing the servant's dress that had somehow survived its transformation back to mundane brown fabric. The silver chains were gone, leaving only pale marks around her wrists where they'd rested for 3 long years, but she could still feel phantom weight where they'd once been. Kieran stood behind her chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, his storm-gray eyes alert despite the exhaustion that lined his face. Even in the relative safety of his private chambers, he radiated the controlled tension of a predator ready to strike at the first sign of threat. Elder Moira had shed her battle-worn appearance and now appeared as she truly was, ancient beyond measure, with silver hair that seemed to hold starlight and eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. She sat across from Lyra with a leather-bound tome in her lap, its pages yellow with age and covered in symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. But it was Lady Seraphina who commanded attention even in repose. The vampire queen, for that's what she was, Lyra had learned, lounged with feline grace in a chair by the fire, her midnight hair catching the light like captured shadows. She'd returned to her simple elegant appearance, but now that Lyra knew what to look for, she could see the power that radiated from her in subtle waves. You're taking this remarkably well, Lady Seraphina observed, her starlight eyes studying Lyra with centuries of accumulated wisdom. Most people require significantly more time to process learning their entire existence has been built on carefully constructed lies. Lyra's laugh held no humor. I think I'm still in shock. 3 years of believing I was broken, cursed, a failure. She shook her head, silver white hair catching the firelight. And you're telling me it was all deliberate? That my own mother orchestrated my disgrace? To protect you, Elder Moira said gently, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols in her book. Elena Nightshade had no choice. The signs were already manifesting, your power was growing stronger each day, and there were interested parties who had begun to take notice. Tell her about her true heritage, Lady Seraphina said, settling deeper into her chair. She deserves to know what bloodline flows in her veins. Elder Moira's expression grew somber as she opened the ancient tome. The pages seemed to glow with inner light as she turned them, revealing illustrations that moved like living memories. Your mother, Elena Nightshade, was not the simple Beta Luna she appeared to be, Elder Moira began, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytelling. She was the last living descendant of the Moonweaver Coven, a line of witches who served as guardians and guides to moon daughters throughout history. The words hit Lyra like physical blows. My mother was a witch? Kieran corrected quietly, his hand tightening on her shoulder. Elena Nightshade is very much alive, though she's been in hiding for the past 3 years, maintaining the magical barriers that kept you hidden until you were strong enough to survive your awakening. Lyra twisted in her chair to stare up at him, pain and anger warring in her violet eyes. She's alive? She let me believe, let me suffer. Her voice broke as 3 years of abandonment and shame crashed over her anew. Because hiding you was the only way to keep you safe, Lady Seraphina said, rising from her chair to move closer. The magical suppression you experienced during your awakening ceremony 3 years ago wasn't a failure, child. It was your mother's spell, designed to mask your true nature until you were mature enough to handle the full awakening. Ready for what? Lyra demanded, tears threatening to fall. For everyone I've ever known to look at me like I'm either a goddess or a monster? For ancient enemies to tear down palace walls trying to claim me? For the responsibility that comes with being what you are, Elder Moira said softly. Moon daughters weren't just beings of great power, Lyra. They were the protectors of the balance between worlds, the guardians of secrets that could reshape reality itself. The last moon daughter. She paused, her ancient eyes growing distant with memory. What happened to her? Lyra asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. She fell in love, Lady Seraphina said simply. With a vampire prince who convinced her that the old ways were wrong, that her power could be used to merge the supernatural and human worlds completely. The magical energies she unleashed in her attempt to create that unity tore holes in the fabric of reality itself. Elder Moira nodded grimly. Entire cities vanished into other dimensions. Creatures from realms that should never touch our world poured through the rifts she created. It took the combined efforts of every supernatural faction to contain the damage and seal the breaches. That's why they called her the Destroyer of Worlds, Lyra whispered, Malakar's words echoing in her memory. The power within you is the same, Lady Seraphina confirmed. But you also have something she lacked, proper guidance, and a mate whose strength can help ground and focus your abilities. Kieran's hand moved from her shoulder to cup her cheek, turning her face up to meet his gaze. Whatever you're meant to become, he said with quiet intensity, you won't face it alone. Before Lyra could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the intimate moment. Kieran's expression immediately shifted to one of dangerous alertness as he called for entry. Alpha Marcus stepped into the study, and Lyra felt her blood turn to ice at the sight of him. Her former Alpha looked haggard, his usually perfectly groomed appearance disheveled, and his scent carried notes of fear and something else she couldn't identify. Your Majesty, Marcus said, bowing deeply to Kieran while carefully avoiding Lyra's gaze. I must speak with you urgently. About the situation we find ourselves in. Speak, Kieran commanded, though his tone carried a warning that made Marcus visibly swallow. The attack tonight has drawn attention we can't afford, Marcus began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I've already received communications from the Vampire Council, the Fae Courts, and the demon hierarchies. They're all demanding information about the Moon Daughter. Lady Seraphina straightened in her chair, her eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. What kind of communications? Marcus pulled a series of letters from his jacket, their seals bearing symbols that made even Elder Moira's expression grow grave. Ultimatums, mostly. Submit the Moon Daughter for evaluation or face the consequences. Over my dead body, Kieran growled, power flickering in his storm-gray eyes. That's what I'm afraid they're counting on, Marcus said, and there was something desperate in his voice now. Your Majesty, we're talking about forces that make tonight's attack look like a children's game. The combined might of all the great packs couldn't stand against what's coming. What are you suggesting? Elder Moira asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Marcus straightened, and for a moment, he looked like the alpha Lyra had once known, strong, decisive, willing to make the hard choices for his pack's survival. "We give them what they want," he said simply. "We turn over the Moon Daughter in exchange for protection. It's one life against thousands." The silence that followed was deafening. Kieran moved with lightning speed, crossing the room to grab Marcus by the throat and slam him against the wall with enough force to crack the stone. His eyes blazed with golden fury, and when he spoke, his voice carried the barely leashed power of his wolf. "Say that again," he whispered, each word dripping with lethal promise. Marcus gasped for air, but his gaze remained defiant. "You know I'm right. She's not one of us, she's something else entirely. Why should we all die for?" He never finished the sentence. Kieran's hand shifted, and there was a wet sound followed by Marcus's body going limp. Alpha Marcus, leader of the Moonstone Pack, fell to the floor with his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. "Treason against one's mate is punishable by death," Kieran said quietly, stepping back from the body. "Royal law." Lyra stared at the corpse in shock, her hand pressed to her mouth. She'd hated Marcus for what he'd done to her, but seeing him killed so casually, so efficiently. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked, kneeling beside her chair with concern replacing the rage in his eyes. "You killed him," she whispered. "He betrayed you. Betrayed us. The penalty for treason has always been death." His voice was gentle, but there was no regret in his expression. "I will always protect what's mine, Lyra. Always." "He won't be the last," Lady Seraphina observed, studying Marcus's body with clinical detachment. "The political ramifications of a Moon Daughter's awakening are significant. Many will see her as either a weapon to be claimed or a threat to be eliminated." Elder Moira was examining the letters Marcus had brought, her expression growing increasingly grave. "These aren't idle threats," she announced. "The Vampire Council is mobilizing 3 legions. The Summer Court has already dispatched their wild hunt. And the demon hierarchies." She paused, her ancient face paling. "They're opening gates that have been sealed for millennia. How long do we have?" Kieran asked, already moving into tactical mode. "Days, perhaps a week if we're fortunate," Lady Seraphina replied. "Which is why we need to begin her training immediately." She stood and moved to where Lyra sat, still staring at Marcus's corpse. "Child, I know this is overwhelming, but we have no time for gentle introductions to your heritage. The power within you is vast, but untrained power is as dangerous to its wielder as to enemies." "I don't know if I can do this," Lyra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can," Kieran said with absolute certainty, taking her hands in his. "You've already proven that. Tonight, you saved us all." Before anyone could respond, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The door burst open without ceremony, and one of Kieran's guards rushed in. "Your Majesty," the guard gasped, dropping to one knee. "Urgent news from the border patrols. Multiple armies have been spotted converging on our territory from all directions." Elder Moira cursed in a language that predated human civilization. "They're moving faster than anticipated." "How many?" Kieran demanded. "Hundreds, Your Majesty. Perhaps thousands. The scouts report seeing creatures that shouldn't exist in our realm." Lady Seraphina moved to the window, gazing out at the pre-dawn darkness with eyes that could see far more than human vision allowed. "They're using forced march techniques and dimensional shortcuts," she announced grimly. "This isn't just opportunistic positioning, this is a coordinated assault by multiple factions." Someone organized this, Kieran realized, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. Someone who knew exactly when and where Lyra would manifest her powers. A new voice spoke from the doorway, cold and filled with malicious satisfaction. "How very astute of you, Your Majesty." They spun to see Cassandra standing in the entrance, but she looked nothing like the pampered Luna in training who had tormented Lyra that morning. Her golden hair was darker now, streaked with silver that seemed to move with its own wind, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of power that was definitely not werewolf in origin. Cassandra, Kieran growled, power flickering around him. How did you get past my guards? She smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. Your guards are indisposed. Don't worry, they're still alive. Mostly. What have you done? Elder Moira demanded, recognizing the signs of magical enhancement. What I had to do to survive, Cassandra replied, stepping into the room with movements that were too fluid, too controlled. Did you really think I would just accept being overshadowed by a broken Omega? That I would watch everything I'd worked for be handed to some cursed freak? Power radiated from her now, dark and hungry and definitely not natural. Behind her, a figure materialized from the shadows, tall, elegant, and carrying the unmistakable aura of something that was very, very old. Allow me to introduce my new patron, Cassandra said with mock courtesy. Lord Abraxas of the 13th Circle. The demon lord stepped fully into the room, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. He was beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers were beautiful, alluring and deadly in equal measure. When he smiled, his teeth were like black diamonds. Alpha King, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. Lady Seraphina. Elder Moira. His gaze finally settled on Lyra, and when it did, she felt like prey being evaluated by a perfect predator. And the infamous Moon Daughter. Such a pleasure to finally meet you. What do you want? Kieran demanded, moving protectively in front of Lyra. Want? Lord Abraxas laughed, and the sound was like silver bells being crushed. My dear king, I want what everyone wants, to witness the convergence. The moment when a Moon Daughter reaches her full power and chooses whether to preserve reality or remake it entirely. His black diamond gaze fixed on Lyra with inhuman intensity. The only question, my dear, is which side you'll choose when that moment comes. She's already chosen, Kieran snarled. Has she? Lord Abraxas smiled wider. We shall see. After all, the night is still young, and there are so many, interesting, parties arriving to meet her. As if summoned by his words, the sound of battle reached them from outside, roars and howls and sounds that definitely weren't made by any earthly creature. The first wave has arrived, Elder Moira announced grimly, moving to the window. And they're not here to negotiate. Through the glass, they could see lights moving across the landscape, not the warm glow of torches, but the cold radiance of magical forces. Hundreds of them, converging on the palace from every direction. Time to see what you're really made of, Moon Daughter, Lord Abraxas said, before dissolving into shadow along with Cassandra. Lady Seraphina was already moving toward the door. The training will have to wait, she announced. It's time for a more practical education. As the sounds of supernatural warfare grew closer, Lyra realized that her quiet life of servitude was truly over. The question now wasn't whether she was ready for what was coming. It was whether the world was ready for what she might become. Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel. Chapter 6. The War Council convened in Kieran's study had the grim efficiency of leaders who understood they were vastly outnumbered. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins that represented the supernatural armies converging on their position like a noose tightening around prey. The Vampire Council's forces took position on the eastern ridge an hour ago, reported Captain Hayes, Kieran's most trusted military advisor. His weathered face bore the strain of coordinating a defense against enemies that defied conventional military tactics. 3 full legions, plus what our scouts describe as flying cavalry that we can't identify. Lady Seraphina studied the eastern markers with the critical eye of someone who understood vampire military doctrine intimately. Flying cavalry would be the Gargoyle Corps, she said grimly. Stone-skinned warriors who can shift between statue and living form at will. Nearly indestructible and absolutely loyal to whoever commands them. Elder Moira traced her finger along the southern approach on the largest map. The Summer Court's wild hunt has taken the forest here. My people count at least 200 riders, plus their hounds. She paused, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of memory. The hounds alone could tear through our defenses in minutes. They're not bound by physical laws the way we are. But it was the northern approach that made even Kieran's expression darken with concern. And the demons? Lord Abraxas wasn't lying about opening sealed gates, Captain Hayes admitted. Our scouts report things emerging from rifts that shouldn't exist. Creatures that hurt to look at directly, that leave scorch marks where they walk. Lyra stood at the window, watching the lights that surrounded the palace like malevolent stars. Each glow represented hundreds of supernatural beings who wanted to either control her or destroy her, and the weight of that knowledge sat like lead in her chest. This is my fault, she said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. All these people are going to die because of what I am. Kieran was beside her in an instant, his strong hands turning her to face him. This is not your fault, he said with the absolute conviction of someone who'd never doubted his own judgment. You didn't choose to be born a moon daughter any more than I chose to be born an alpha king. We don't get to pick our destinies, love. We only get to choose how we face them. The endearment sent warmth through her chest despite the circumstances. Love. He'd called her love, and somehow that simple word made the approaching armies seem less terrifying. Kieran's right, Lady Seraphina said, rising from where she'd been studying intelligence reports. Besides, this convergence was inevitable the moment you awakened. Better to face it with allies than alone and unprepared. A commotion in the corridor outside interrupted their planning. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, and then a knock so urgent it might have been the drumbeat of war itself. Enter, Kieran commanded, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Lyra's lower back in a gesture of protection that was becoming second nature. The door burst open to reveal two of Kieran's guards escorting a pair of women who made Lyra's heart stop. The first was Emma Hartwell, her human friend from the medical facility, but Emma looked nothing like the gentle nurse Lyra remembered. Her usually soft brown hair was streaked with silver that moved like liquid metal, and her eyes, once a warm hazel, now held depths that spoke of power awakening. She wore traveling clothes that looked like they'd seen hard use, and a pendant around her neck pulsed with the same lunar energy that Lyra recognized in her own magic. But it was the second woman who made Lyra's breath catch entirely. Elena Nightshade stood in the doorway like a figure from a half-remembered dream. She was smaller than Lyra remembered, more fragile, but the power that radiated from her was unmistakable. Her auburn hair, the same shade Lyra's had been before her transformation, was streaked with premature white, and her violet eyes held depths of love and sorrow that made Lyra's chest ache. "Hello, my darling daughter," Elena said, her voice carrying the musical quality that Lyra had inherited. "I'm so sorry I'm late." For a moment, nobody moved. 3 years of abandonment, shame, and carefully buried love hung in the air between mother and daughter like a chasm that might be impossible to cross. Then Lyra was moving, crossing the room in a rush that ended with her throwing herself into her mother's arms. Elena caught her with the desperate strength of someone reclaiming the most precious thing in their world, and both women were crying before they'd even spoken. "I thought you were dead," Lyra sobbed against her mother's shoulder. "I thought you hated me for what I'd become." "Never," Elena whispered fiercely, her hand stroking Lyra's silver-white hair. "Never, never, never. Everything I did, every moment of separation, it was all to keep you safe until you were strong enough for this moment." The magical suppression at her awakening ceremony, Lady Seraphina said, understanding flickering in her ancient eyes. "You've been maintaining that spell for 3 years?" Elena nodded, finally pulling back to cup Lyra's face in her hands. The suppression field, the masking enchantments, the barriers that kept other supernatural beings from sensing what she truly was, all of it. It nearly killed me to maintain them for so long, but it was the only way. "And Emma?" Elder Moira asked, her gaze fixed on the transformed nurse with growing recognition. Emma stepped forward, her new silver-streaked hair catching the firelight in ways that human hair never should. "My name isn't really Emma Hartwell," she admitted, her voice carrying a slight accent that hadn't been there before. "It's Amelia Starweaver, and I'm from the Guardian bloodline, families who've served as protectors and guides to moon daughters for over 2 millennia. The revelation hit Lyra like a physical blow. "You've been watching me? This whole time?" "Protecting you," Amelia corrected gently. "When your mother contacted the remaining Guardian families 3 years ago, I volunteered to stay close and monitor your condition. The cancer treatments. She smiled ruefully. A convenient fiction that allowed me to accept financial help without arousing suspicion about why a human nurse would befriend a disgraced Omega. How many others? Kieran asked, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. Guardians? Perhaps a dozen families still carry the bloodline, Elena replied. Moon daughters? 3 others that we know of, though they're all still deeply hidden. Lyra's awakening was spectacular, compared to the gradual manifestations we've been carefully managing elsewhere. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, new sounds reached them from outside. Not the organized movement of armies, but something else, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Elder Moira rushed to the window, her face paling as she took in whatever she saw. Necromancers, she breathed. They're raising the dead. Through the glass, they could see new lights appearing across the battlefield, not the cold radiance of vampire forces or the wild glow of fey magic, but something that pulsed with the sick green luminescence of corrupted lunar power. The chanting grew louder, and with it came the sound that would haunt nightmares for generations to come. The howling of wolves that should have been at peace. Cassandra, Kieran snarled, recognizing the tactical signature of their transformed enemy. She's raising shadow-corrupted werewolf zombies. From where? Lady Seraphina demanded. The old battlefields, Elena whispered, horror dawning in her voice. There are burial sites across this territory where pack warriors have been laid to rest for centuries. If she's corrupting their remains. The implications were staggering. Werewolf zombies retained much of their supernatural strength and speed while being completely under their necromancer's control. Worse, they felt no pain, needed no rest, and would continue fighting until physically destroyed. How many? Kieran asked grimly. Captain Hayes was already coordinating with scouts through his communication crystal. Initial estimates suggest hundreds, Your Majesty. Perhaps thousands. She's been busy. 3 armies wasn't enough, Lyra said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Now we're facing 4 different factions, all of whom want me dead or worse. Not all of them want you dead, a new voice said from the shadows, and Lord Abraxas materialized near the fireplace with the casual arrogance of a being who feared nothing in the mortal realm. Some of us simply want to utilize your unique capabilities. Kieran moved with lightning speed, but the demon lord merely smiled as claws passed through his partially corporeal form. Now, Abraxas chided, no need for violence when we can discuss this civilly. I come bearing a proposal. We're not interested, Kieran growled. Oh, but you should be. You see, the young moon daughter has a choice to make, and that choice will determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone in this palace. The demon's black diamond eyes fixed on Lyra with predatory interest. She can come with me willingly, learn to harness her full power under proper guidance, and watch as I call off the other armies currently preparing to reduce this place to rubble. And if she refuses? Elena asked, her voice steady despite the fear Lyra could smell in her scent. Then everyone she cares about dies, Abraxas said simply. The vampires will drain every person in this palace to fuel their binding rituals. The Fae will trap their souls in eternal torment as punishment for harboring a threat to their realm. And the zombies. He smiled, revealing those black diamond teeth. Well, they'll simply tear everyone apart. There's a third option, Lady Seraphina said quietly, her own power beginning to flare in response to the demon's presence. Is there? Abraxas looked genuinely curious. We fight, Kieran said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd never backed down from impossible odds. All of them. Together. Against 4 armies? My dear king, even your considerable abilities have limits. Then we'll discover what those limits are, Kieran replied, and there was something in his tone that made even the demon lord's expression grow thoughtful. As if his words had been a signal, the first sounds of battle reached them from the outer defenses. Roars, howls, the clash of supernatural forces meeting in deadly combat. Through the windows, they could see flashes of light as various magics collided in the darkness. The siege has begun, Elder Moira announced unnecessarily. Abraxas sighed like a teacher disappointed with a promising student's poor choices. Very well. When you realize the futility of resistance, you know how to contact me. He turned those black diamond eyes on Lyra one final time. And you, my dear moon daughter, remember that this carnage is the result of choosing pride over pragmatism. With that, he dissolved back into shadow, leaving only the lingering scent of sulfur and promises. Report, Kieran barked into his communication crystal. Eastern perimeter is under assault, came the crackling reply. Vampire forces are testing our defensive lines with coordinated strikes. Southern approach shows Fey cavalry movements, they're trying to flank us through the forest. Northern gate. A pause filled with the sounds of supernatural combat. Northern gate is holding, but those demon creatures are unlike anything we've trained for. And the western approach? Zombie wolves, Your Majesty. Hundreds of them, led by that Cassandra woman. She's changed. Whatever she's become, she's directing them with tactical precision we didn't expect from undead forces. Lady Seraphina was already moving toward the door. I need to coordinate with the vampire forces under my command. They're the only ones who can effectively counter the Council's binding magic. I'll take the Fae, Elder Moira said, her ancient power flaring as she prepared for battle. My pack has old alliances with some of the Summer Court nobles. Perhaps we can split their forces. The demons are mine, Kieran declared, his eyes already beginning to glow with the golden fire of his wolf. What about me? Lyra asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. You, Elena said firmly, are going to learn 3 years' worth of magical theory in the next 10 minutes, because like it or not, you're the only one here with enough power to turn the tide of this battle. As the sounds of supernatural warfare grew closer, as the palace shook under the assault of forces that should never have existed in the same realm, Lyra realized she stood at the most important crossroads of her life. She could flee to safety, as every instinct screamed for her to do. Or she could stand and fight for the people she loved, using powers she barely understood against enemies that had walked out of nightmare. The choice, she realized, had never really been a choice at all. Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel. Chapter 7. The battle had been raging for 2 hours when the moon began to bleed. Lyra felt it first as a stirring in her chest, a resonance that made her newly awakened power hum with anticipation. She was in the palace's highest tower with Elena, desperately trying to master basic lunar magic techniques while the sounds of supernatural warfare echoed from every direction below. Focus on the light, not the emotion, Elena instructed, her voice strained from maintaining protective barriers around the palace. Lunar magic responds to clarity of purpose, not raw feeling. But as Lyra reached for the serene control her mother described, something changed in the very air around them. The silver moonlight streaming through the tower's crystal windows began to shift, taking on a crimson tinge that made her skin prickle with warning. Mother, Lyra whispered, pointing toward the sky. Elena looked up and went pale as bone. Blessed goddess, no. Not tonight. Above them, the full moon was transforming. What had been pure silver radiance was now bleeding red from the edges inward, as if some cosmic wound was spreading across its surface. The sight was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a blood moon of impossible intensity. What does it mean? Lyra asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the way power was building in her chest like a storm gathering strength. Blood moons amplify all lunar magic exponentially, Elena said, her hands already weaving protective spells around them both. But this one. She studied the crimson orb with growing alarm. This isn't natural. Someone has forced the alignment. As if summoned by her words, the power within Lyra exploded outward. The surge was nothing like the controlled manifestations she'd experienced during her awakening. This was raw, primal force that had been magnified beyond all reason by the blood moon's influence. Silver-red light erupted from her skin, turning her into a beacon that could be seen for miles in every direction. The crystal windows of the tower didn't just shatter, they vaporized, becoming clouds of glittering dust that danced around her like living constellations. The stone walls began to crack, spiderwebs of light spreading outward from where her power touched them. Lyra, you have to control it. Elena shouted over the sound of reality itself groaning under the pressure. But control was beyond her now. The blood moon's influence had turned her careful awakening into a supernova of cosmic force, and worse, something else was responding to that power. Rifts began to tear open in the air around them. They started small, pinpricks of absolute darkness that seemed to devour light itself. But as Lyra's uncontrolled power continued to surge, the rifts widened, revealing glimpses of other realms that should never touch their world. Through one, she saw a realm of eternal fire where creatures of living flame danced in patterns that hurt to observe. Through another, a dimension of ice so cold that the very air had crystallized into geometric sculptures of impossible beauty. And through the largest rift, something that made her soul recoil in horror, a void where reality itself had been devoured, leaving only hungry darkness that pressed against the boundaries of their world like a tide of nothingness. The dimensional barriers, Elena gasped, her own power flaring as she tried to contain the rifts. She's tearing holes between worlds. From the battlefields below, new sounds reached them, roars and screams that definitely didn't belong to any creature from their realm. Things were beginning to slip through the cracks Lyra's power had torn in reality. That's when Malachar returned. He materialized not from shadow this time, but from the largest dimensional rift, and he brought friends. Behind him poured creatures that existed at the edge of nightmare, beings of living void that seemed to absorb not just light but hope itself. They moved with purpose that spoke of intelligence vast and alien, and at their approach, even the other supernatural armies below began to retreat in terror. Magnificent, Malachar said, his void-black eyes drinking in the chaos around them. Even more powerful than the Void Lords predicted. Void Lords? Elena stepped protectively in front of Lyra, her own magic flaring. You serve the Void Lords? Malachar's smile revealed teeth like obsidian daggers. I have served them for millennia, waiting for this moment. The last Moon Daughter was too weak, too limited in her vision. But this one. His gaze fixed on Lyra with predatory satisfaction. This one can tear down the barriers between all realities, merge every dimension into the perfect chaos my masters desire. She won't, Elena snarled, power crackling around her like lightning. She already is, Malachar replied, gesturing to the expanding rifts. The blood moon wasn't natural, my masters forced the alignment specifically to trigger this surge. Every moment she remains uncontrolled, more barriers weaken. Soon, all of existence will become one glorious maelstrom of infinite possibility. Before Elena could respond, another figure materialized in the tower, Lady Seraphina, but transformed beyond recognition. Gone was the elegant vampire Queen Lyra remembered. In her place stood something far older and infinitely more powerful. Her midnight hair now held actual stars, tiny points of light that moved like living constellations. Her eyes had become windows into eternity itself, and wings of pure shadow and starlight stretched from her shoulders. Power radiated from her in waves that made even Malachar take a step back. Enough, she said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. Lady Seraphina, Elena breathed, recognition and something else, relief, flickering in her eyes. Not Lady Seraphina, the transformed figure corrected, her ancient gaze fixing on Lyra with an intensity that made her breath catch. I am Seraphina the Eternal, last queen of the first vampires, guardian of the dimensional barriers, and... Her expression softened with love so profound it made Lyra's heart ache. Your grandmother, my precious child. The revelation hit Lyra like a physical blow. Grandmother? Your mother's bloodline carries more than just witch magic, Seraphina explained, even as she began weaving spells to contain the expanding rifts. Elena is my daughter, born of a union between vampire royalty and the Moonweaver Coven. You carry both legacies in your blood. Which is why you're so much stronger than previous Moon Daughters, Malachar said, his tone carrying grudging admiration. Vampire magic and lunar power, perfectly blended. The Void Lords have been planning this convergence for centuries. As if to prove his point, Lyra's power surged again, and the largest rift tore wider. Through it, she could see the Void Realm more clearly now, a dimension where reality had been completely devoured, leaving only hungry darkness that pressed against every barrier like a cosmic predator seeking new worlds to consume. And from the battlefields below, she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice. Kieran's roar of pain. She rushed to the destroyed windows and looked down to see chaos beyond imagination. The various supernatural armies had abandoned their siege of the palace and were now fighting desperately against the creatures pouring through her dimensional rifts. But in the center of it all, she saw Kieran in his massive wolf form, surrounded by void spawn that were slowly overwhelming his defenses. He was injured, badly, and even his incredible strength couldn't hold against the tide of otherworldly horrors that had emerged from the rifts she'd torn open. "Choose, Moon Daughter," Malachar said, his voice carrying cruel satisfaction. "Use your power to save your mate, and watch as the dimensional barriers collapse completely, dooming all of existence to chaos. Or contain the rifts and let him die to preserve reality itself." The choice hit her like a blade to the heart. Save Kieran and destroy everything, or let the man she loved die to protect countless worlds from annihilation. "There has to be another way," she whispered, power still surging through her in uncontrolled waves. "There isn't," Malachar said with mock sympathy. "This is the burden of power, child. Sometimes love must be sacrificed for the greater good." "He's right," Elena said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, my darling, but you can't save him and contain the rifts. The power required, it's too much for one person." But as Lyra stared down at Kieran fighting for his life, as she felt the dimensional barriers weakening under the pressure of her uncontrolled abilities, inspiration struck like lightning. "You're right," she said, turning to face her mother and grandmother. "It's too much for one person." Understanding dawned in Seraphina's ancient eyes. "The sharing ritual," she breathed. "But it's never been attempted with this much power involved." "The risk. The risk of doing nothing is worse," Lyra interrupted, her violet eyes blazing with determination and desperate hope. "Can it work?" "In theory," Elena said slowly. "If we link our bloodlines completely, vampire, witch, and moon daughter magic working in perfect harmony, we might be able to contain the rifts and save Kieran." "Might" being the operative word, Seraphina added grimly. "If the sharing fails, all three of us die, and the barriers collapse anyway." "And if we succeed?" "If we succeed," her grandmother said with the first smile Lyra had seen from her since the revelation, "we create something that's never existed before, a true fusion of the three most powerful magical bloodlines in existence." Below them, Kieran's roar echoed again, weaker this time, and Lyra felt something tear in her chest that had nothing to do with dimensional rifts. "Do it," she said without hesitation. "Show me how." Elena and Seraphina exchanged a look that carried centuries of accumulated love and wisdom, then moved to flank Lyra on either side. "Join hands," Elena instructed. "And whatever happens, don't let go. The sharing ritual requires absolute trust between participants." As their hands linked, 3 generations of women bound by blood and desperation, Lyra felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around them. This wasn't just magical collaboration, this was family coming together to face the impossible. "On 3, Seraphina said, her ancient power already beginning to flow toward Lyra. 1. Below them, more void spawn poured through the expanding rifts. 2. Kieran stumbled, overwhelmed by creatures that should never have existed. 3. The power that erupted from their joined hands was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Vampire magic, witchcraft, and lunar force blended into something entirely new, a golden-silver radiance that seemed to sing with the harmony of creation itself. But even as the sharing ritual began, even as their combined power started to seal the dimensional rifts, Malachar's laughter echoed through the tower. "Too late," he called, gesturing toward the largest rift. "Do you see what comes?" Through the closing portal, something vast and terrible was stirring in the void realm. Not void spawn or dimensional parasites, but something infinitely worse, one of the void lords themselves, ancient beyond measure and hungry for the complete destruction of ordered reality. As the ritual reached its crescendo, as their combined power fought to seal the rifts before cosmic annihilation could slip through, Lyra realized they were racing against more than time. They were racing against the awakening of something that could unmake existence itself. Wanna watch more videos like this? Do well to like this video, and subscribe to this channel. Chapter 8. The gold-and-silver radiance that flowed between Lyra, Elena, and Seraphina was beautiful beyond description, but it wasn't enough. Even with their combined power, the dimensional rifts were fighting their attempts at closure, and the void realm pressed against the weakening barriers like a cosmic predator sensing wounded prey. "We need more anchors," Seraphina gasped, her ancient strength straining against forces that existed beyond normal reality. The sharing ritual requires 5 points of connection to achieve perfect stability. Through the destroyed windows of the tower, Lyra could see Kieran still fighting desperately against the void spawn below. His massive wolf form was bloodied but unbroken, his golden eyes blazing with the determination that had made him king. But he was weakening, and she could feel their mate bond pulling at her heart like a physical tether. "Kieran," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "He's my mate, the bond makes him a natural anchor point." "And Amelia," Elena added, her witch magic flaring as she fought to maintain their connection. Guardian bloodlines were specifically bred to channel and focus Moon Daughter power. "But they're both in the battle," Lyra protested. "How can we?" "The mate bond transcends physical distance," Seraphina said, her vampire heritage allowing her to tap into knowledge that spanned millennia. "And guardian magic responds to need above all else. Call to them, child. Let them feel what we're trying to do." Lyra closed her eyes and reached out through the connection she shared with Kieran, that golden thread of love and recognition that had snapped into place the moment they'd met. Through their bond, she felt his fierce protectiveness, his absolute determination to keep her safe, and underneath it all, his unwavering faith in her strength. "I need you," she whispered through their connection. "Not just as my mate, but as my partner in this. Help me save everyone." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power flooded through their mate bond, not just Kieran's considerable strength, but something deeper. His absolute trust, his willingness to share not just his magic but his very essence with her. The golden light of their connection blazed brighter, reaching across the distance to envelop them both. At the same moment, she felt another presence joining their circle. Amelia's guardian magic resonated with the same frequency as the Moon Daughter power, creating harmonies that had been lost for centuries. The nurse-turned-protector was still in the palace courtyard, helping evacuate wounded defenders, but her magical essence flowed upward to join the growing confluence of power. 5 points of connection. 5 bloodlines that had been meant to work together since the dawn of supernatural civilization. "Now," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment. "The lunar convergence ritual begins." What happened next would be remembered in legend for as long as supernatural beings drew breath. The blood moon above them began to shift again, but this time the crimson light was being purified by the gold-and-silver radiance emanating from their joined circle. The malevolent red that had been forced upon it by Void Lord manipulation slowly gave way to something entirely new, a moon that showed both silver and gold, lunar and solar light perfectly balanced. The transformation spread outward in waves that were visible to every supernatural being on the battlefield below. Vampire, fae, demon, and werewolf alike stopped fighting as the purifying energy washed over them, healing wounds that were both physical and spiritual. But it was the effect on the corrupted beings that truly defied belief. The shadow-corrupted werewolf zombies that Cassandra had raised began to change, their unnatural green glow fading as the darkness that animated them was gently dissolved. Instead of crumbling to dust, they transformed back into their original forms, but alive, healed, and free of the necromantic corruption that had bound them. The void spawn that had poured through the dimensional rift screamed as the purifying light touched them, but their screams gradually shifted from agony to something else entirely. Relief. Joy. Freedom. The creatures that had seemed like manifestations of pure evil were revealed to be beings that had been twisted by the Void Lord's influence, now restored to their original natures as guardians of dimensional boundaries. Even the demon forces led by Lord Abraxas were affected. The twisted creatures that had served him began to shed their corrupted forms, revealing themselves to be fallen angels who had been enslaved by void magic for millennia. And at the center of it all, Malachar himself underwent the most dramatic transformation. The Shadow Alpha, who had seemed like the embodiment of evil, fell to his knees as waves of purifying energy washed over him. His void-black eyes flickered, showing flashes of their original color, a warm brown that spoke of the wolf he had once been before the Void Lords claimed him. "No," he gasped, his voice losing the inhuman harmonics that had marked him as corrupted. "I can't, they've owned me for so long." "Not anymore," Lyra said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had finally embraced what she was meant to become. "The corruption ends here." The gold-and-silver light intensified around Malachar, and slowly, impossibly, the shadow that had clung to him for centuries began to dissolve. Beneath it was revealed a wolf who had once been noble, who had fought against the void for longer than most civilizations had existed before finally succumbing to influences no mortal mind could resist. "I remember," he whispered, tears streaming down a face that was no longer pale and inhuman. "I remember who I was before they took me." As the lunar convergence reached its peak, the dimensional rifts began to seal with a sound like reality itself sighing in relief. The void realm's hungry darkness retreated, contained once again behind barriers that were now stronger than they had ever been. But the most remarkable change was happening within the circle itself. The five-way power sharing wasn't just combining their individual abilities, it was creating something entirely new. Lyra could feel her consciousness expanding, touching Elena's witch wisdom, Seraphina's vampiric eternity, Kieran's alpha strength, and Emilia's guardian dedication. They were still individual beings, but they were also something more. The first moon circle in over 1,000 years. A fusion of supernatural bloodlines that created a new type of magical entity, one capable of maintaining the balance between all realms, all realities, all possibilities. "It's done," Seraphina breathed, wonder in her ancient voice. "The convergence is complete." Around them, the battlefield had fallen silent. Supernatural beings who had been trying to kill each other minutes before now stood in awed contemplation of what they had witnessed. The purifying energy had not only healed their physical wounds but had dissolved the mistrust and territorial hatred that had driven them to war. Lord Abraxas approached the tower, but he was no longer the demon lord who had threatened them. The purification had revealed his true nature, a seraph who had been corrupted by void influence, now restored to his original glory. His black diamond teeth had become pearls of light, and wings of pure radiance stretched from his shoulders. "Moon Daughter," he said, his voice now carrying harmonics of joy rather than malice. "Forgive me. I had forgotten what it was like to choose my own actions." "There's nothing to forgive," Lyra replied, and meant it. "We were all victims of the Void Lord's manipulation." Over the following hours, as dawn broke over a transformed world, the magnitude of what had been accomplished became clear. The lunar convergence hadn't just ended the immediate crisis, it had fundamentally changed the nature of supernatural society itself. Representatives from every faction that had come to claim or destroy Lyra now approached as allies, seeking to understand their role in this new reality. Elder Moira spoke for the werewolf packs, while other figures emerged to represent vampire covens, fae courts, and even the redeemed demon hierarchies. "We need a new structure," Kieran said, his hand intertwined with Lyra's as they stood before the assembled supernatural nobility. "The old ways of territorial competition and factional conflict led us to the brink of dimensional collapse." "A council," Seraphina suggested, her restored seraph nature giving her words additional weight. "Representatives from each major supernatural group, working together to maintain the balance the moon circle has restored." With the moon circle at its center, Elena added. "As guardians and guides, not rulers." But it was Lyra who provided the final piece of the new world order. "Not just the moon circle," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of someone who had literally saved existence itself. "Kieran and I will rule together, as equals. The age of single leaders commanding from isolation is over. From now on, we govern through unity." The supernatural community's response was immediate and unanimous. They had seen what happened when power was concentrated in the hands of beings who could be corrupted or manipulated. The moon circle's demonstration of shared strength offered a better path forward. Over the following weeks, the new supernatural council was established with representatives from every major faction. Decisions were made through consensus rather than domination, with the moon circle serving as mediators when conflicts arose. And through it all, Lyra and Kieran's relationship deepened from the desperate mate bond forged in crisis to something richer and more profound. They were partners in every sense, in love, in leadership, and in the ongoing work of maintaining the delicate balance between realms. Their mating ceremony took place under the light of the transformed moon, now permanently showing both silver and gold in perfect harmony. The ritual was attended by representatives from every supernatural community, marking not just the union of two individuals but the symbolic marriage of all supernatural factions into a greater whole. But perhaps the most remarkable development came 6 months after the convergence. Reports are coming in from around the world, Emilia announced during one of their regular council meetings. Moon daughters are awakening everywhere. The news sent ripples of excitement through the supernatural community. Lyra's awakening and the subsequent convergence had apparently triggered a global response, with young women of the appropriate bloodlines beginning to manifest moon daughter abilities across every continent. How many? Lyra asked, though part of her already knew the answer would reshape everything once again. At last count, 17 confirmed awakenings, with more being reported daily, Emilia replied. The Guardian families are mobilizing to provide support and training. A network, Elena breathed, understanding the implications immediately. Not just one moon daughter maintaining the balance, but a global network of them, all connected through the power you've awakened. As if to confirm her words, Lyra felt something shift in her consciousness, a gentle presence that spoke of sisters awakening across the world, each one adding their strength to the growing web of protection that now surrounded the planet. The age of supernatural conflict was over. The age of unity had begun. 6 months later, Lyra stood on the balcony of their new home, not a palace built for one ruler, but a residence designed for partners who governed together. The structure itself embodied their new philosophy, rooms that flowed into each other rather than being separated by barriers, spaces designed for collaboration rather than isolation. In the gardens below, supernatural beings of every type worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. Vampire architects collaborated with Fae artists to create beauty that transcended any single vision. Werewolf engineers worked alongside redeemed demons to build transportation networks that connected previously isolated communities. Regrets? Kieran asked, joining her at the balcony railing. 6 months of shared leadership had only strengthened their bond, proving that power could indeed be multiplied rather than divided when wielded by partners who trusted each other completely. None, Lyra replied, leaning into his embrace. Though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Cassandra hadn't forced me to sing that night. Someone else would have, Kieran said with certainty. The convergence was always going to happen. The only question was whether we'd be ready for it. In the distance, the transformed moon was rising, no longer silver or blood red, but showing the golden-silver radiance that had become the symbol of their new world. Under its light, supernatural beings who had been enemies for millennia continued the work of building something unprecedented in the history of any realm. A society based not on domination, but on cooperation. Not on fear, but on the understanding that their greatest strength came from their unity. The Moon Daughter's choice had saved more than just one world. It had saved the very concept of hope itself. Want to watch more videos like this? Please do well to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Also, I would like to know where you are listening from and your thoughts on this video. Do well to drop it in the comment section. Don't forget to share this video, family and friends. The end.